I'm Peter Borenius, and we're at Coombe Bissett on the banks of the River Ebble.
Tell me about the condition of the river this year.
It is more discoloured than I have ever seen it during any May in the whole of my 60 years that I've known the Ebble. I'm 72 and I've fished the Ebble for over 60 years. Generally, at this time of year, it will be running crystal clear with great banks of water buttercup weed, beds of very clear gravel, and masses of trout rising in the channels between the weed. As we look at it now, we can see it is a sort of murky brownish grey colour. There's hardly any growing ranunculus. There's certainly no fish rising whatever, and this should be the height of the trout fishing season, when there should be fish rising everywhere. There are a number of factors which have contributed to the decline of our chalk streams. First and foremost, undoubtedly, the low rainfall that we've experienced for the last 5 years. The long-term average has not been reached for the last 5 years, and that's absolutely exceptional. It very often happens that long-term average is not reached for 1 or 2 years, but then it's always made up by 1 or 2 years of above long-term average rainfall. But what we've had in the last 5 years has been a consistent below long-term average rainfall. This has caused the aquifers to become depleted, the underground sources of the water which feed all these chalk streams, and our rivers are running incredibly low for the time of year. A change in wildlife since when I first came to the Ebble Valley for my holidays in 1929, 1930 onwards, is actually phenomenal. We used to hear every evening a bird called the curlew. That usually presaged rain, and practically every evening you had rain promised by the song of the curlew, and it arrived the next day. I have not heard a curlew in this valley for over 30 years now. It has completely disappeared. We used to have immense flocks of plover, the green plover, sometimes known as the peewit, I think is its popular name. These are almost non-existent now in this valley. We get a few of them, but there used to be thousands, and now there are probably dozens where there used to be thousands. Now, the reason for those changes is the change in agricultural use of the land. When I was a child, they used to have what they call hatches, little adjustable dams, every quarter of a mile all the way down the river. These hatches were used to raise the water level in the early spring, and
just to hold the river back,
to raise the water level in order to be able to divert the river all over the fields in the little side ditches, which were called carriers, for carrying water all over the fields.
Now, interestingly enough, you're trying a similar sort of experiment yourself here, where you've placed a weir in the river just at the back of your house, and you're diverting the river over a space of something like 15, 20 yards, quite a distance over into what were the old water meadows here.
The purpose of this is to raise the soil moisture density in this little meadow we're in, and to try to restore the whole environment to the type of environment we had 30 or 40 years ago. I remember some of these old Wiltshire characters that impressed me so much as a small boy. I was born in London, spent most of my life in towns, but every summer we came down here, and I was immensely impressed by the way the labourers used to talk about their experiences. I remember there was a man who did some gardening for my mother, and she complained to him, "You know, those blackbirds, they're doing an awful lot of harm, they're eating all our soft fruit up." And he replied, "Mum, in my opinion, it's two-legged birds that are taking them fruits." Of course, he meant thieves, so that was one of our favourite phrases. He was a great gossiper, that gardener, and I can still see him in my mind's eye leaning on his fork and saying, well, there's some people in the villages I shouldn't like to mention. For instance, there's old Mrs. So-and-so, and then up would come some scandalous piece of gossip. In fact, it always became a phrase in our family, some people as I shouldn't like to mention. He always mentioned them immediately after he said he wouldn't like to mention them. The Ebble Valley is famous for being a place where one lady who wanted to be alone lived for considerable periods just after the war, and that was Greta Garbo, who lived somewhere up around Broad Chalke, if I remember rightly. I must say I never met her because she was a lady who wanted to be alone, but it certainly must have suited anyone who was of a solitary disposition. Particularly in those days, there was hardly anyone in the Ebble Valley apart from the local people. In the Wiltshire streams, most of the fish will take bread.
So does that mean that folk can just wander down by the side of the river and flick bread in like they would feed for the trout, like they would feed the ducks?
Yes, as long as the pieces of bread are not too large, it will almost certainly bring trout up if there are any trout around. And most of the village boys know this perfectly well, actually, and get very unpopular with the fishermen as a result.
Why is that unpopular with the fishermen? Surely it's nothing wrong with just feeding the trout.
Oh, feeding them is all right, but when you feed them with a hook attached, it's a different story, isn't it?